So I'll be completely honest with you. This was actually going to be my first video on YouTube, so the quality's not that great. I had actually written this script 6 months ago and was actually going to air this episode pretty rapidly. However, this happened.
I think we should maybe start thinking about battleships, by the way.
Then suddenly the fun little script that I had originally had, which talked about restoring the battleships and how it was just a kind of a phase and a meme that will eventually go away, suddenly became controversial and political, and I really didn't want to do that. And when the first video kind of script got tossed, I wasn't sure I wanted to do it in the first place. But alas, my people have spoken and have decided that they wanted naval ranks, and since this is my first script that was on that topic, I guess we're going to have to go into it. I'm not going to get very political in this one, I really don't want to, so the script has been edited, the video has been changed quite a bit, so it might be a little bit different. That being said, I do hope you enjoy this format a little bit better than the one that I had been doing before. It's not going to take a rocket scientist to realize whose format has actually inspired this video and the script in general. Lazer Pig is a much more entertaining YouTuber than I will ever be. You should definitely check him out, especially if you're going to watch one of these videos. That said, there are going to be quite a few similarities as the script was originally inspired while listening to some of his videos. I actually find his format educating and entertaining as compared to a slideshow explaining on and on about how air, water, and power are a lot more important to a battleship than, say, caliber or gun size. I also feel quite safe in the fact that I've forgotten more information about a battleship and naval history than I will ever care to admit. The fact of the matter is that his videos typically topic about aircraft and tanks, whereas my videos here will probably talk about more naval history of the same era. It also is not an area that's really a lot covered because most people see and immediately forget what they were talking about. In fact, what was I talking about? Oh, right. Battleships and reactivating them being stupid. Okay, I'm gonna get back to the meat of the video here in a second, so go ahead and enjoy it, or just angrily comment below. At least you got to see one good YouTuber before I got started. Battleships! You love them, I love them, everyone loves them. Battleships have been a part of human history for centuries. Constant game of whose country's got the biggest and baddest toys. Not only were almost all of them striking and beautiful ships that possessed the physical embodiment of the country that it was owned by, the pure power they represented was enough to make nations pause and think, maybe I will consider that trade agreement. The real underlying issue is that battleships represent the hard work of its people collectively. It gives them something to be proud of and cherish, while also ignoring all the big problems that they have in their country. That's why when the Hood made an oopsie while facing off with the Germans, it became a nationwide call to arms to sink the culprit in an execution style that would make a modern terrorist blush. The point is, battleships were beloved by the countries who built them, their people, and the sailors who sailed them. There's a lot of emotion and pride behind these metal machines, and, they have only stopped being in service less than 40 years ago. The last one being decommissioned in 1991. It's a lot of history and pride just to end so recently. A lot of those people who lived or are on or around these ships not only are alive today, but in high positions of power or, quote, advisory roles in the military positions. If you know anything about the reformers, and you can kind of see where this is going. Hi, post-production this old ship here. My original script talked about how John Lehman was a reformer and had actually been involved with the fighter plane mafia. It turns out that this is not true, or at least as far as I can tell. He was considered a naval reformer, but I really don't want to drag a fellow sailor's reputation through the mud without actually fully going into what monumental task he had with Reagan. That being said, the reformers are still very much involved in the fact that Iowas are very much looked upon with envy and glee in trying to be reactivated, mostly because the reformers are in the firm belief that old technology is better, even despite the fact that a Tomahawk land attack missile or anti-ship missiles are going to be able to handle the task at hand a lot better than, say, 20-mile range guns. And I get it, who doesn't love the guns on the battleship? They're the most striking feature. They're the best feature. No, the prettiest, at least. The reality is that the guns on the battleship have a 20 nautical mile range, give or take. They can go up 5 or less, 5 nautical miles based on conditions of the sea and the wind. That being said, the guns are not necessarily good for naval combat anymore. They're just no longer relevant. Their primary role in the Navy was NFFS, or Naval Fire Support, a role which is now usually taken up by aircraft, because by the time the Marines actually get to the shore, they're not doing a D-Day style landing that requires battleship support, but rather setting up base camp and setting up forward operation bases on the beach so that they can begin a full-scale invasion of a country. Where was I? Oh yeah, back to the video. Sorry about that. Went on a tangent there about the guns again. They're very distracting.
All right, gentlemen, let's kick this pig.
Let's do a scenario. Congratulations! The president just called and told you that he wants to bring the battleships back into service. You have the monumental task of taking an 80-year-old museum and thrusting it into frontline service. Ignore the criticism. Ignore the costs. But what is that going to actually look like, bringing a World War II ship back into the modern era? Let's start with the amount of work just for New Jersey. From the outside, she looks brand new. Easily capable of being reactivated, right? Ah! Well, first things first, you're going to have to seize control of the ship. That means close the museum, fire the staff. Shortly after, you're going to have to let contractors on board to conduct the next couple weeks of surveys. They're going to try and figure out what works, what doesn't work, what's out of date, what needs to be replaced, and what can't be replaced. At the same time, you're going to have to assemble a crew, not only to take the ship to sea in the future, but to take it to the next upcoming yard period and stand guard. Yep, that's right. Despite literally coming out of the dry dock last year, USS New Jersey would still have to go right back into dry dock to undo all of the work that the museum did to preserve the ship. It's the museum's job to keep the ship afloat after all, not to keep it ready for sea. Anyone who believes that a ship can just be taken from museum status and thrown right back to sea in the same day is misinformed or watched a crappy 2012 movie that was literally Navy propaganda! Let's get back to New Jersey. First things first, you're going to have to remove the top portion of the mast in order for the ship to fit under the bridge in the first place. Then to tug it back down the river into the Philadelphia Naval Yard. We're going to assume this takes about 6 to 8 weeks just to complete the prep time, not including the waiting time it takes to get the ship into dry dock, which can take up to a year, if not longer. Keep in mind, it took years of work just to get the New Jersey into the dry dock by their museum. Yes, the museum did that, not the government. The dry docking was crowdfunded. Not a single taxpayer's dime was spent on dry docking New Jersey. Your first and primary task once the ship is actually out of the water is going to be removing the shaft seal covers. These are large metal welded covers that are designed to protect the rubber seals that allow the shaft to actually, exit the boat. The shaft seals are the most vulnerable part of the boat. That's why the museums typically close them up, so that they don't actually cause the ship to sink. Might as well, while you're back there, remove the shafts entirely and conduct the inspections in order to see what needs to be replaced. You might as well replace the seals as well because they're old. You can't have the pride of your new fleet sinking in the harbor. Right, North Korea? China? Guys, back me up here! Since you have the ship out of the water, you might as well remove all the through-hull opening covers all around the boat. These are massive welded steel plate covers that prevent seawater from entering the ship's engineering plant. These are great for a museum. They keep the water on the upside of the ship. Not so great for a ship that you intend to use. Especially not so great for a ship that you think you can use within 24 hours. All this time, you're going to also have to be inspecting and possibly replacing the main reduction gears. These are massive transmissions that are connected between the engine and the propellers. They're expensive, they're huge. They're so expensive and huge that the Navy doesn't actually own them. That's how expensive they are. The issue is that museums don't seem to understand that you don't remove the massive deadbolt locks that are supposed to keep people out and keep small things out of them too, like coins and stuff that people tend to throw into transmissions. Seriously, please stop doing that. You wouldn't throw coins into your own car's transmission. Why are you doing it to my ship? Assuming this doesn't immediately sink the project, boat pun, you have to overhaul the turbines, the condensers, the boilers, and of course, might as well add a fresh coat of paint, make it look nice and shiny, not to mention removing all the artifacts that made a battleship a museum. You also have to remove things like the main stack covers, exhibits, artifacts, children's play areas, and in New Jersey's case, a massive commercial air conditioning system that was installed to help control the climate control systems. This is to make the ship go to sea, not to get the ship ready to fight, let alone be near peer to modern naval combat. Because believe it or not, big guns does not mean that your warship actually capable of fighting or sinking anything in the realm of modern naval combat. All of this is just going to make the cost go up and the work slow down. And the prospects of your ship being put to sea before you even leave office from old age or conflict that you don't want her ready for is starting to look a little shaky. The fact of the matter is that this very short list that I just spelled out for you is very much just the tip of the iceberg. This is just talking about New Jersey, the one that's most ready to go if, something ever actually happened. The reality is if you took all 4 Iowa-class battleships today and said, congratulations, you're now in the fleet, only 2 of them would probably be actually capable of ever being reactivated within your lifetime. For example, USS Iowa still has damage in her number 1 turret from when it literally exploded. They still haven't fixed that. It was never fixed when she was decommissioned, and it's now the museum's problem, and the museum has no intentions of really fixing it anytime soon. I mean, it's practically a gravesite. And of course, USS Missouri has 2 problems. One, she's a memorial. In fact, all the battleships are technically considered memorials. The biggest problem facing Missouri is the fact that she's in Hawaii. Now, the shipyard facilities in Hawaii are, in theory, capable of handling a ship as big as Missouri again, but not reactivating. You see, all the materials and facilities that would be capable of reactivating a ship like her would be basically based in California, or Ingalls in Louisiana, which is where the Iowas were reactivated when they were first taken out of mothball. The point is, if you took all 4 Iowa-class battleships, realistically speaking, you'd only get 2 of them back into service. And again, not anytime soon. Realistically speaking, a timeline would probably be anywhere between 5 to 10 years. 5 if you're rushing and you don't really care whether or not the ship is going to actually be able to fight, but realistically we're looking at 10 years. And this isn't including the infrastructure that used to house a battleship or maintain a battleship being reactivated, repaired, or rebuilt, or all the ammunition that needs to be now procured, and all the factories that used to make said ammunition need to be activated or rebuilt to actually be able to use the guns that everybody claims to love so much. Now, I know what some of you are probably already typing angrily into the comments while frothing at the moves. But the Navy requires that the museums be kept in a maintained and battle-ready status, so that they can be brought back in months, no, days, instead of this years. Or for example, I heard the museums are required to keep ready ammunition just in case of another Pearl Harbor. Or the Navy has a contract that tells the museums that they're not allowed to touch the engineering systems, and that there's a clause that they can take the ship back at any time, etc., etc. And I know what some of you are thinking, why did I read those in funny voices? Or why didn't I read this script before I actually said it out loud? Well, let's just go ahead and go through some of the context of these headline stories that generate clickbaits and give you some facts that will dispel some of them, shall we? Well, most of them. I'm not going to dispel the fact of why I'm barely reading my own handwriting. Don't judge me!
Sing it, Walk, sing it! Sing it, Walk! Sing it, Walk!
First, the Navy does not require the museums to have ready service ammunition, fuel, or anything along that matter stored anywhere near the ship to be brought back to life in an emergency, maintenance runs, or another Pearl Harbor. This is completely false. You can look anywhere around the ship and you'll see these large display rounds. They're training rounds. They're inert. They've been painted to look like they have high explosives in them, but the reality is they've not had high explosives in them for a very long time, and if they did, they're completely been demilled. Nor is it exactly a safe idea to store high explosives where children take regular school trips. I mean, come on, guys. The New Jersey has a playground on board. Now that's the ammunition handled. Boom, pun. Let's talk about fuel. It doesn't make any sense to store fuel on a ship that doesn't intend to use it. They're not fuel tanks after all, they're ships. Especially since fuel has a best-by date. Fuel oil is expensive, heavy, gets everywhere, expires over time, and corrosive. It also has a nasty tendency of being flammable when stored in a partially empty volume or space, let's call it a tank, that is subject to fluctuations in temperature. Like, I don't know, in an air-conditioned museum in the middle of Virginia summer, by chance, where the temperatures can get up to 115 degrees. Now, there are some systems on the ship that still have residual fuel oil. It gets everywhere. For example, the 5-inch mounts on the Wisconsin are actually leaking oil from the barbette. This is caused by a broken seal in the gasket O-rings between the barbette and the actual gun. They're leaking, and they're still trying to clean them up every day. It's actually getting to the point where it's leaking off the deck. It's also been recently discovered that a boat winch had a full tank of lubrication oil, and it had to be properly drained because the seal of the tank had deteriorated away, causing it to spill out onto the deck. Lastly, it was also recently discovered that a Liberty boat on the USS Wisconsin still had half a tank of gas on board. It's now been on the list to be drained, and most likely too old to use anyway. It's also a fire hazard. Actually, you know what? I'm going to dispel this rumor too while I'm at it. There is no evidence on the ship of any system being preserved, specifically the engines, in grease or oil. In fact, the only evidence that I have seen of this matter is of an unrep station or boat davits and winch. It was actually recently discovered that the aft storage locker on the USS Wisconsin had oil completely on the deck. The reason for this is all the gears and components were stored in plastic bags that were then filled with lubrication oil to preserve them. The discovery led to the immediate closure of the space as the oil contains trace amounts of PCB, which are hazardous, and the space needs to be ventilated in hopes of ever being reopened or any of the artifacts actually being recovered, to hopefully be put on display. All of this combined with the blanks over the covers and vital systems, the through-hole openings, propellers literally being locked in place to the boat, kind of shatters the idea of the 80-year-old museum ship being heroically activated by a bunch of veterans to be thrusted into a fight without immediately realizing that the ship they're floating in is actually a building and needs years of work, a fleet of tugs if it's ever going to see the open ocean. Even then, you're not going to be firing any weapons. Sorry, Hollywood.
Something magical and full of wonder.
It's called a contract.
No, I don't want to talk about the contract. Ugh. Okay, fine. I'll talk about the contract. Here before you is Naval Contract N002400C0201. Happy? This is the contract that the Navy has agreed to when they hand over the ship to a museum. Specifically, this one is in reference to the USS New Jersey. So I could go on for the next 25 minutes explaining every single detail of the 3 subsections that are talking about it, but then I would probably get in trouble for being political, as one of the terminations talks about our president-in-chief. So instead, I am just going to talk about the highlights of it. This is the first video that I'm talking about that's controversial, and the last thing I want is to be dragged into the politics kicking and screaming.
Why can't you just be normal?
So let's talk about the first part of the contract that everyone kind of references. Section 2, subparagraph B. It talks about not activating certain systems on the ship for the purpose of navigation or movement of the vessel under its own power. Now, a lot of people typically refer this to evidence that the Navy wants to be able to reuse the ship, which is partially true. In case the ship ever gets reactivated, the last thing you want is all the engine hours to be ramped up because they took it out for a joyride. The reality is, it's not the full truth. It looks really bad on the US Navy if you say a museum ship were to get underway and suddenly sink in the harbor. It doesn't look good. It also doesn't look good if, say, museum ship was involved in a criminal act. It still represents the Navy, despite actually being no longer a naval ship or owned by the Navy or operated by the Navy. That's why so many people rush to the comments to scream about how New Jersey was paid for by the government in order to be refitted and reactivated in her dry docking, when in reality it was the local donations that got her into the dry dock to be preserved by the museum. Navy was not involved in the process whatsoever, aside from providing information. Had nothing to do with the project whatsoever. In fact, they look at these ships as a write-off when it comes to actually doing anything when it comes to these museum ships. And I'll prove it later on as well when we talk about the USS Link. Don't worry, we'll get there. Alright, we're gonna have to at least mention Section 8. And I'm not gonna go into too much detail about it because everyone else in the comments is already going to. The fact of the matter is, Section 8 talks about how the government could seize the ship in an event of a national emergency. And at the current rate this government is going, they declare a national emergency over everything. So legally speaking, they could take the ship. And legally speaking, they probably might. But legally speaking, the US government can also seize your house and all your assets for national emergency. Will they do it? Not necessarily, but they could. And you'd be pretty pissed off if they did. That being said, I have a feeling that the backlash from reactivating the IOS is going to be a lot more than the actual praise. It'd be similar to how people would react in Russia if they started throwing older T-34s from museums into frontline service, only to watch them be annihilated by Ukrainian drones. It wouldn't show strength or prowess, but weakness and desperation. Although it'd be rather horrifying to watch my fellow sailors abandoning the ship when it gets struck by an anti-ship missile, it would be kinda ironic to see all those that praise the battleship's armor to Pikachu face when they see that an anti-ship missile is an anti-ship missile. It does not care about battleship armor. It will still cut through it. Now that that's out of the way, we can talk about Section 8 subparagraph B. It talks about the default of the donee. In the event that the museum fails to meet obligations in the contract, the Navy can seize the ship, take it back in order to protect the vessel. The same is kind of said in subparagraph C, which refers to imminent danger, but this is typically only used if the vessel becomes an actual hazard to public safety. The only record of this actually being used is on the USS Edison. The museum couldn't afford to take care of the ship, so they transferred it back to the Navy, who immediately took her to Philadelphia to be scrapped, only at the last second to be rescued by another museum, where she kind of sits today in Chicago. Why am I saying this? What is this all for? Well, the Navy can take the ship back, but will it? Short answer is no. Long answer is you think the Navy can screw this back? Meet the USS Link.
Hello.
She's a Boleo-class diesel-electric submarine. She was built too late to actually join the war. Instead, she ended up being used as a training ship before being taken in as a museum in 1972. She was restored and put on display in the waterfront at in New Jersey. She appeared in a movie in 2010 called Katya, where she pretends to be a Soviet submarine that sinks off the coast of Oahu, which sounds awesome. Hi, post-production and very cold this old ship here. So it turns out that the Katya movie in 2011 is actually a short movie. It's only 23 minutes long, and the only source I've been able to find of this movie is an IMDb rating, which gives it a single sentence. It says, during a single taxi ride, lives the two unlikely Russians coverage over the death of sailors 30 years ago aboard the Soviet submarine K-129. And frankly, that sounds like a terrible movie. Not the K-129, that's actually a really fun story, and I might cover that in a future video. I mean, it's the one time that America tried to steal a submarine, and instead drove a billionaire insane. I'm talking about Howard Hughes, of course. Anyway, back to the show. Now, the Link's problems really began in 2007, when the owner of the dock had kindly informed the museum that the land they had been sitting on had been sold for redevelopment. This meant that the home that they had been using is now going to be an apartment complex, and they had to find a new one relatively quickly. Not that quickly. I mean, they had till 2018. So, I mean, this is boats we're talking about. Things take years. Instead, however, she found that her locks had been cut, and the ship was flooded and sank in the harbor. Artifacts were stolen, and a mysterious insurance claim was made for the total loss of the ship. Now, it's never been confirmed that she was intentionally sunk for insurance claims or a weird Save the Whale style campaign where you cut out the middleman and shoot the whale in the head. But it is a tiny bit suspicious that the vandals, instead of just taking some things or maybe some weird pictures and vandalizing the ship, decided to pull the literal sea valves and open all the doors. I mean, could you imagine if you're a dumb kid with your friends and decide to break into a museum ship? You have a brilliant idea for a joke. You go, ooh, let's go to the main spaces and open the seawater valve and sink the museum, instead of being a dumb kid and doing dumb kid things like, I don't know, playing inside a torpedo tube, exploring off-limit areas, and then YouTubing it or something, or whatever the kids do. Oh, yes, let's steal some plaques and souvenirs that would be damaged if we sank the ship. Makes sense to you? Or does it sound a little weird, too? Anyway, Ling's insurance claim was denied, which surprised no one. A new group of volunteers had taken command of the ship and decided to refloat her and restart her restoration efforts to try and get her underway as quickly as possible. They still fly the Don't Give Up the Ship flag as a reminder that they still exist. However, a new home is still needed, and unfortunately, as the years go by, Ling is actually now stuck in the river that she is currently in due to being lowered for drinking. Ling was a prime example of the naval contract being pushed to its limit. At any point, the Navy could have immediately filed a suit, claimed that the museum was in default of the terms of their contract, or at the very least, said that the ship was in imminent danger and swooped in and rescued the submarine, probably sold it to the closest scrapyard for pocket change and pennies. What do you mean they got rid of that? What am I supposed to buy my aircraft carriers with now? Now, why didn't the Navy get involved? Well, it's actually really simple. The Navy writes off the ship the second it's been turned into a museum, so it doesn't really see it as an asset anymore, or a viable one at that. In fact, the one time that the Navy was actually in charge of a museum, it was called the USS Barry. She was actually sold because attendance numbers had dropped in the 1990s, which led to the eventual scrapping of the ship. It's kind of sad because it's one of the very few Forrest Sherman-class destroyers that was left. And the Barry was actually in really good condition due to the fact that it was literally owned by the Navy. They didn't have a problem getting parts, which is a problem that most museums deal with on a regular basis. The same thing was going to happen to the USS Edison before it was transferred away from the Navy and given to another museum, a fact that has saved her from the scrapping yards ever since. But I know this is not why you clicked on this video. Say the president actually does want to reactivate the Iowas, but what's the biggest problems? What does that actually look like? So your number one problem is going to be cost, because unfortunately, you can't have cake and have a battleship too. They're too expensive. Iowas were notoriously expensive. It costs on average about $1 to $3 million a day to run the ship. Adjusted for 2025 money, that's about $5 to $8 million, because like it or not, inflation still exists. Let's compare that to an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. On average, every day, an Arleigh Burke-class costs about $540,000. So for the price of one Iowa-class battleship to be running, you could afford 14 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. And they're much more capable than an Iowa, and very much able to shoot down missiles that are coming for them. Also, unlike Iowas, they have the capability of destroying a city from 1,000 miles away. And yes, I'm aware that the Iowas had Tomahawk land attack missiles as well, but the system on the ship is outdated and no longer works, so that would have to be updated too in order to achieve the same effect. So let's say, to hell with the cost. What is this actually going to look like? Because I'm still not answering the question, and I'm sure that you've already let me know that. But I see three scenarios playing. The first case scenario is being the best case scenario. Let's say it doesn't take 10 years to reactivate the ship. The administration will see backlash for activating an 80-year war memorial for basically a vanity project. The ship would serve their countries proudly, no doubt, but most likely there would be an accident or two from the knowledge that was lost from the ship being so outdated and old. At best, a few injuries, at worst, deaths, or even the loss of the ship that is most likely blamed on a sailor to prevent blame on the Navy or the government. Looking at you, Iowa turret explosion, Bonhomme Richard fire. You don't get off that easy. The most likely conclusion to this scenario, if everything went alright and the ship wasn't lost in an accident, is that the ship would be decommissioned again, and the best case scenario, they return to their museums. Worst case scenario, they're scrapped for metal. That's scenario one. That's the literal best case scenario. The most likely is that the ship is going to take about 10 years to be recommissioned. And about 3 years into the project, give or take, depending on change in administration, someone realizes how much money has actually been poured into this. And then they send cries of horror and cancel the project. leaving the ship in a half-complete state. Because she's half-complete, she's unfit for service. But because she's so expensive, she's going to most likely be towed back to mothball. And because she has brand new equipment on board, she's not exactly going to be given back to the museums, especially since the current naval admin is a little bit reluctant to give naval ships to museums. In fact, a lot of them have been denied. That unfortunately means that at the end of this scenario, that the most likely case is that the Iowas would be scrapped, which is the unfortunate fate for any ship that is in the mothball yards currently. The last scenario is unfortunately equally likely to the other two, but this is the worst case scenario. Let's say the United States spends billions of dollars to steamroll the project and get the ship underway as quickly as possible. This means shortcuts and for the sake of keeping the schedule out of fear of being fired or making the administration unhappy. This would unfortunately be at the cost of future sailors' lives, as they would not be focused on making the ship combat relevant or any way good for the sake of making the ship look nice. Oh, but don't you worry, they'll look brand new, freshly painted, they'll have a whole propaganda stream just to make sure that you don't doubt that they are not as capable as they used to be, or the fact that they've been gutted for years to be museums. Unfortunately, there are no happy endings in this scenario. The best case is that the ship isn't destroyed if it sees action. Instead, it's just used as a parade boat, kind of like the Kuznetsov or the Kirov, where they're paraded about, but underlying, they're very much only capable of getting underway, and usually with a tug. Another ending to this scenario is quite simple, is that she's used as a propaganda ship, basically to kind of bolster the morale of the troops, and look good, fire heavy shots, and then basically that's it. She isn't used for much more. The most likely end to this scenario, however, does mean that she will probably be sunk for propaganda purposes. Example being the USS Maine, where she was used as a rallying call to arms to start the Spanish-American War. She could also be lost in an accident, kind of like how the Kuznetsov ended up in a maintenance nightmare trying to remain relevant, only to be burned at the stake when her yard workers eventually failed to actually achieve anything useful, and the funds were drained out of the yards by their local oligarch. The last case being one of the worst is that the ship is sunk in action. This will be the worst case scenario, as it will involve the loss of life and sailors who didn't know that they were being used as a propaganda machine or bait. The point is, I love battleships. You love battleships. But they are 80-year-old museums. They deserve to rest just as much as any other museum ship. They've served their country. They're retired. Bringing them back would only be a nightmare and should be a cause for concern. The best thing you can do right now is to enjoy them. Donate to the museums. Spend time aboard. Enjoy them as much as you can. Just because the Navy doesn't have them anymore doesn't mean you can't enjoy them. They're your ships too. Because like it or not, if the Navy did actually get the ships back, it would most likely mean that you would never see the ships again. Hi, if you're listening to this is me recording it in post at the end of the video. Thank you for watching. I hope it was enjoyable, even if it wasn't everyone's favorite subject. This was very much an experiment. I had originally planned that this was going to be the first video I ever put out on YouTube. However, the algorithm kind of favors quantity over quality, and I unfortunately don't have a lot of time between my volunteer service hours on the Wisconsin and my active duty service now. That said, I kind of enjoyed making this video, and I hope you guys got some entertainment and education out of it too. I have a few more scripts like this lined up. If you guys enjoyed it, definitely leave a like. It doesn't, I mean, I will never ever say that ever again. If you do want to see more of this, please leave a like and let me know. Otherwise, I'm just probably gonna not do them anymore. I really do want to move away from the video game stuff a little bit, just because, again, the YouTube market's pretty saturated with crap. And I do love Space Engineers, and I do keep playing Modern Engineers. I do love it. This video itself took 2 weeks just to produce and get back up in full speed, not including the 6 months hiatus and wait time. Anyway, if this gets popular, I won't try to ramble too much. I will start working on the next one. If not, then, I'll continue with the Modern Engineers, because time really only dictates that I can actually work on one, not two. That said, if you guys do want to hear about the next one is possibly about the Kirov, but mostly about shit simulation generation and people relying on video games to determine who would win versus. anyway, if that sounds interesting to you, please leave a like and let me know. If not, then I guess this will disappear into the ether of media stream, I guess. Anyway, thank you. Bye. These are some of the other videos I have. Check them out too. Okay, I'll stop.